Chapter 29 of Wives and Daughters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 29, Bushfighting. During all the months that had elapsed since Mrs. Hamley's death, Molly had wondered many a time about the secret she had so unwittingly become possessed of that last day in the Hall library. It seemed so utterly strange and unheard of a thing, to her inexperienced mind, that a man should be married and yet not live with his wife, that a son should have entered into the holy state of matrimony without his father's knowledge, and without being recognized as the husband of some one known or unknown by all those with whom he came in daily contact, that she felt occasionally as if that little 10 minutes of revelation must have been a vision in a dream. Both Roger and Osborne had kept the most entire silence on the subject ever since. Not even a look or a pause betrayed any allusion to it. It even seemed to have passed out of their thoughts. There had been the great sad event of their mother's death to fill their minds on the next occasion of their meeting Molly, and since then long pauses of intercourse had taken place, so that she sometimes felt as if each of the brothers must have forgotten how she had come to know their important secret. She often found herself entirely forgetting it, but perhaps the consciousness of it was present to her unawares, and enabled her to comprehend the real nature of Osborne's feelings towards Cynthia. At any rate, she never for a moment had supposed that his gentle, kind manner towards Cynthia was anything but the courtesy of a friend. Strange to say, in these latter days Molly had looked upon Osborne's relation to herself as pretty much the same as that in which at one time she had considered Roger's, and she thought of the former as of some one as nearly a brother both to Cynthia and herself as any young man could well be whom they had not known in childhood, and who was in no wise related to them. She thought that he was very much improved in manner, and probably in character, by his mother's death. He was no longer sarcastic, or fastidious, or vain, or self-confident. She did not know how often all these styles of talk or of behaviour were put on to conceal shyness or consciousness, and to veil the real self from strangers. Osborne's conversation and ways might very possibly have been just the same as before, had he been thrown amongst new people, but Molly only saw him in their own circle, in which he was on terms of decided intimacy. Still, there was no doubt that he was really improved, though perhaps not to the extent for which Molly gave him credit; and this exaggeration on her part arose very naturally from the fact that he, perceiving Roger's warm admiration for Cynthia, withdrew a little out of his brother's way, and used to go and talk to Molly in order not to intrude himself between Roger and Cynthia. Of the two, perhaps, Osborne preferred Molly. To her he needed not to talk if the mood was not on him. They were on those happy terms where silence is permissible, and where efforts to act against the prevailing mood of the mind are not required. Sometimes, indeed, when Osborne was in the humour to be critical and fastidious as of yore, he used to vex Roger by insisting upon it that Molly was prettier than Cynthia. "You mark my words, Roger, 5 years hence the beautiful Cynthia's red and white will have become just a little coarse, and her figure will have thickened, while Molly's will only have developed into more perfect grace. I don't believe the girl has done growing yet. I am sure she is taller than when I first saw her last summer." Miss Kirkpatrick's eyes must always be perfection. I cannot fancy any could come up to them. Soft, grave, appealing, tender, and such a heavenly colour. I often try to find something in nature to compare them to. They are not like violets. That blue in the eyes is too like physical weakness of sight. They are not like the sky. That colour has something of cruelty in it." "Come, don't go on trying to match her eyes as if you were a draper, and they a bit of ribbon. Say at once her eyes are lodestars, and have done with it. I set up Molly's grey eyes and curling black lashes, long odds above the other young woman's. But of course it's all a matter of taste." And now both Osborne and Roger had left the neighbourhood, in spite of all that Mrs. Gibson had said about Roger's visits being ill timed and intrusive. She began to feel as if they had been a very pleasant variety, now they had ceased altogether. He brought in a whiff of a new atmosphere from that of Hollingford. He and his brother had always been ready to do numberless little things which only a man can do for women, small services which Mr. Gibson was always too busy to render. For the good doctor's business grew upon him. He thought that this increase was owing to his greater skill and experience, and he would probably have been mortified if he could have known how many of his patients were solely biassed in sending for him by the fact that he was employed at the Towers. Something of this sort must have been contemplated in the low scale of payment adopted long ago by the Cumnor family. Of itself, the money he received for going to the Towers would hardly have paid him for horseflesh. But then, as Lady Cumnor in her younger days had worded it, "It is such a thing for a man just setting up in practice for himself to be able to say he attends at this house." So the prestige was tacitly sold and paid for, but neither buyer nor seller defined the nature of the bargain. On the whole, it was as well that Mr. Gibson spent so much of his time from home. He sometimes thought so himself when he heard his wife's plaintive fret or pretty babble over totally indifferent things, and perceived of how flimsy a nature were all her fine sentiments. Still he did not allow himself to repine over the step he had taken. He wilfully shut his eyes and waxed up his ears to many small things that he knew would have irritated him if he had attended to them; and in his solitary rides he forced himself to dwell on the positive advantages that had accrued to him and his through his marriage. He had obtained an unexceptional chaperon, if not a tender mother, for his little girl, a skilful manager of his formerly disorderly household, a woman who was graceful and pleasant to look at for the head of his table. Moreover, Cynthia reckoned for something in the favourable side of the balance. She was a capital companion for Molly, and the two were evidently very fond of each other. The feminine companionship of the mother and daughter was agreeable to him as well as to his child. When Mrs. Gibson was moderately sensible and not over sentimental, he mentally added, and then he checked himself, for he would not allow himself to become more aware of her faults and foibles by defining them. At any rate, she was harmless, and wonderfully just to Molly for a stepmother. She piqued herself upon this indeed, and would often call attention to the fact of her being unlike other women in this respect. Just then sudden tears came into Mr. Gibson's eyes, as he remembered how quiet and undemonstrative his little Molly had become in her general behaviour to him, but how once or twice, when they had met upon the stairs, or were otherwise unwitnessed, she had caught him and kissed him, hand or cheek, in a sad passionateness of affection. But in a moment he began to whistle an old Scotch air he had heard in his childhood, and which had never recurred to his memory since; and 5 minutes afterwards he was too busily treating a case of white swelling in the knee of a little boy, and thinking how to relieve the poor mother, who went out charing all day, and had to listen to the moans of her child all night, to have any thought of his own cares, which, if they really existed, were of so trifling a nature compared to the hard reality of this hopeless woe. Osborne came home first. He returned, in fact, not long after Roger had gone away; but he was languid and unwell, and though he did not complain, he felt unequal to any exertion. Thus a week or more elapsed before any of the Gibsons knew that he was at the Hall, and then it was only by chance that they had become aware of it. Mr. Gibson met him in one of the lanes near Hamley. The acute surgeon noticed the gait of the man as he came near, before he recognized who it was. When he overtook him, he said, "Why, Osborne, is it you? I thought it was an old man of 50 loitering before me. I didn't know you had come back." "Yes," said Osborne. "I've been at home nearly 10 days. I daresay I ought to have called on your people, for I made a half promise to Mrs. Gibson to let her know as soon as I returned. But the fact is, I'm feeling very good for nothing. This air oppresses me. I can hardly breathe in the house, and yet I'm already tired with this short walk. You'd better get home at once, and I'll call and see you as I come back from Rose." "No, you mustn't on any account," said Osborne, hastily. "My father is annoyed enough about my going from home so often, he says, though it was 6 weeks. He puts down all my languor to my having been away. He keeps the purse strings, you know," he added, with a faint smile. "And I'm in the unlucky position of a penniless heir, and I've been brought up so. In fact, I must leave home from time to time, and if my father gets confirmed in this notion of his that my health is worse for my absences, he will stop the supplies altogether." "May I ask where you do spend your time when you are not at Hamley Hall?" asked Mr. Gibson, with some hesitation in his manner. "No," replied Osborne, reluctantly. "I will tell you this. I stay with friends in the country. I lead a life which ought to be conducive to health, because it is thoroughly simple, rational, and happy. And now I've told you more about it than my father himself knows. He never asked me where I have been, and I shouldn't tell him if he did. At least, I think not." Mr. Gibson rode on by Osborne's side, not speaking for a moment or two. "Osborne, whatever scrapes you may have got into, I should advise you telling your father boldly out. I know him, and I know he'll be angry enough at first, but he'll come round, take my word for it, and somehow or another he'll find money to pay your debts, and set you free, if it's that kind of difficulty. And if it's any other kind of entanglement, why, still he's your best friend. It's this estrangement from your father that's telling on your health, I'll be bound." "No," said Osborne. "I beg your pardon, but it's not that. I am really out of order. I daresay my unwillingness to encounter any displeasure from my father is the consequence of my indisposition; but I'll answer for it, it is not the cause of it. My instinct tells me there is something real the matter with me." "Come, don't be setting up your instinct against the profession," said Mr. Gibson, cheerily. He dismounted, and throwing the reins on his horse round his arm, he looked at Osborne's tongue and felt his pulse, asking him various questions. At the end he said, "We'll soon bring you about, though I should like a little more quiet talk with you, without this tugging brute for a third. If you'll manage to ride over and lunch with us to morrow, Dr. Nicholls will be with us. He's coming over to see old Rowe, and you shall have the benefit of the advice of 2 doctors instead of 1. Go home now, you've had enough exercise for the middle of the day, as hot as this is, and don't mope in the house, listening to the maunderings of your stupid instinct." "What else have I to do?" said Osborne. "My father and I are not companions. One can't read and write for ever, especially when there is no end to be gained by it. I don't mind telling you, but in confidence, recollect that I've been trying to get some of my poems published, but there's no one like a publisher for taking the conceit out of one. Not a man among them would take them as a gift." "Oh ho! So that's it, is it, Master Osborne? I thought there was some mental cause for this depression of health. I wouldn't trouble my head about it if I were you, though that's always very easily said, I know. Try your hand at prose, if you can't manage to please the publishers with poetry; but at any rate don't go on fretting over spilt milk. But I mustn't lose my time here. Come over to us to morrow, as I said, and what with the wisdom of 2 doctors, and the wit and folly of 3 women, I think we shall cheer you up a bit." So saying, Mr. Gibson remounted, and rode away at the long slinging trot so well known to the country people as the doctor's pace. "I don't like his looks," thought Mr. Gibson to himself at night, as over his day books he reviewed the events of the day. And then his pulse. "But how often we're all mistaken! And 10 to 1 my own hidden enemy lies closer to me than his does to him, even taking the worst view of the case." Osborne made his appearance a considerable time before luncheon the next morning, and no one objected to the earliness of his call. He was feeling better. There were few signs of the invalid about him, and what few there were disappeared under the bright pleasant influence of such a welcome as he received from all. Molly and Cynthia had much to tell him of the small proceedings since he went away, or to relate the conclusions of half accomplished projects. Cynthia was often on the point of some gay, careless inquiry as to where he had been, and what he had been doing; but Molly, who conjectured the truth, as often interfered to spare him the pain of equivocation, a pain that her tender conscience would have felt for him, much more than he would have felt it for himself. Mrs. Gibson's talk was desultory, complimentary, and sentimental, after her usual fashion; but still, on the whole, though Osborne smiled to himself at much that she said, it was soothing and agreeable. Presently Dr. Nicholls and Mr. Gibson came in. The former had had some conference with the latter on the subject of Osborne's health, and from time to time the skilful old physician's sharp and observant eyes gave a comprehensive look at Osborne. Then there was lunch, when every one was merry and hungry, excepting the hostess, who was trying to train her midday appetite into the genteelest of all ways, and thought, falsely enough, that Dr. Nicholls was a good person to practise the semblance of ill health upon, and that he would give her the proper civil amount of commiseration for her ailments, which every guest ought to bestow upon a hostess who complains of her delicacy of health. The old doctor was too cunning a man to fall into this trap. He would keep recommending her to try the coarsest viands on the table, and at last he told her if she could not fancy the cold beef, to try a little with pickled onions. There was a twinkle in his eye as he said this, that would have betrayed his humour to any observer; but Mr. Gibson, Cynthia, and Molly were all attacking Osborne on the subject of some literary preference he had expressed, and Dr. Nicholls had Mrs. Gibson quite at his mercy. She was not sorry when luncheon was over to leave the room to the 3 gentlemen, and ever afterwards she spoke of Dr. Nicholls as "that bear." Presently Osborne came upstairs, and after his old fashion began to take up new books, and to question the girls as to their music. Mrs. Gibson had to go out and pay some calls, so she left the 3 together, and after a while they adjourned into the garden, Osborne lounging on a chair, while Molly employed herself busily in tying up carnations, and Cynthia gathered flowers in her careless, graceful way. "I hope you notice a difference in our occupations, Mr. Hamley. Molly, you see, devotes herself to the useful, and I to the ornamental. Please, under what head do you class what you are doing? I think you might help one of us, instead of looking on like the grand seigneur." "I don't know what I can do," said he, rather plaintively. "I should like to be useful, but I don't know how, and my day is past for purely ornamental work. You must let me be, I am afraid. Besides, I am really rather exhausted by being questioned and pulled about by those good doctors." "Why, you don't mean to say they have been attacking you since lunch!" exclaimed Molly. "Yes, indeed, they have; and they might have gone on till now if Mrs. Gibson had not come in opportunely." "I thought mamma had gone out some time ago," said Cynthia, catching wafts of the conversation as she flitted hither and thither among the flowers. "She came into the dining room not 5 minutes ago. Do you want her? For I see her crossing the hall at this very moment," and Osborne half rose. "Oh, not at all," said Cynthia, "only she seemed to be in such a hurry to go out. I fancied she had set off long ago. She had some errand to do for Lady Cumnor, and she thought she could manage to catch the housekeeper, who is always in the town on Thursday." "Are the family coming to the Towers this autumn?" "I believe so, but I don't know, and I don't much care. They don't take kindly to me," continued Cynthia, "and so I suppose I am not generous enough to take kindly to them." "I should have thought that such a very unusual blot in their discrimination would have interested you in them as extraordinary people," said Osborne, with a little air of conscious gallantry. "Isn't that a compliment?" said Cynthia, after a pause of mock meditation. "If any one pays me a compliment, please let it be short and clear. I'm very stupid at finding out hidden meanings." "Then such speeches as 'You are very pretty,' or 'You have charming manners,' are what you prefer? Now I pique myself on wrapping up my sugar plums delicately." "Then would you please to write them down, and at my leisure I'll parse them." "No, it would be too much trouble. I'll meet you half way, and study clearness next time." "What are you two talking about?" said Molly, resting on her light spade. "It's only a discussion on the best way of administering compliments," said Cynthia, taking up her flower basket again, but not going out of the reach of the conversation. "I don't like them at all, in any way," said Molly. "But perhaps it's rather sour grapes with me," she added. "Nonsense!" said Osborne. "Shall I tell you what I heard of you at the ball?" "Or shall I provoke Mr. Preston," said Cynthia, "to begin upon you? It is like turning a tap, such a stream of pretty speeches flow out at the moment." Her lip curled with scorn. "For you, perhaps," said Molly, "but not for me. For any woman, it is his notion of making himself agreeable. If you dare me, Molly, I will try the experiment, and you'll see with what success." "No, don't, pray," said Molly, in a hurry. "I do so dislike him." "Why?" said Osborne, roused to a little curiosity by her vehemence. "Oh, I don't know. He never seems to know what one is feeling." "He wouldn't care if he did know," said Cynthia; "and he might know if he is not wanted. If he chooses to stay, he cares little whether he is wanted or not." "Come, this is very interesting," said Osborne. "It is like the strophe and antistrophe in a Greek chorus. Pray go on." "Don't you know him?" asked Molly. "Yes, by sight, and I think we were introduced once; but you know we are much farther from Ashcombe at Hamley than you are here at Hollingford." "Oh, but he is coming to take Mr. Sheepshanks' place, and then he will live here altogether," said Molly. "Molly, who told you that?" said Cynthia, in quite a different tone of voice to that in which she had been speaking hitherto. "Papa, didn't you hear him?" "Oh, no, it was before you were down this morning. Papa met Mr. Sheepshanks yesterday, and he told him it was all settled. You know we heard a rumour about it in the spring." Cynthia was very silent after this. Presently she said that she had gathered all the flowers she had wanted, and that the heat was so great she would go indoors; and then Osborne went away. But Molly had set herself a task to dig up some roots as had already flowered, and to put down some bedding plants in their stead. Tired and heated as she was, she finished it, and then went upstairs to rest, and change her dress. According to her wont, she sought for Cynthia. There was no reply to her soft knock at the bedroom door opposite to her own, and thinking that Cynthia might have fallen asleep, and be lying uncovered in the draught of the open window, she went in softly. Cynthia was lying upon the bed as if she had thrown herself down on it without caring for the ease or comfort of her position. She was very still, and Molly took a shawl and was going to place it over her when she opened her eyes and spoke. "Is that you, dear? Don't go. I like to know that you are there." So she shut her eyes again, and remained quite quiet for a few minutes longer. Then she started up into a sitting posture, pushed her hair away from her forehead and burning eyes, and gazed intently at Molly. "Do you know what I've been thinking, dear?" said she. I think I've been long enough here, and that I had better go out as a governess." "Cynthia, what do you mean?" asked Molly, aghast. "You've been asleep. You've been dreaming. You're overtired," she continued, sitting down on the bed and taking Cynthia's passive hand and stroking it softly, a mode of caressing that had come down to her from her mother, whether as an hereditary instinct or as a lingering remembrance of the tender ways of the dead woman, Mr. Gibson often wondered within himself when he observed it. "Oh, how good you are, Molly! I wonder, if I had been brought up like you, if I should have been as good. But I've been tossed about so." "Then don't go and be tossed about any more," said Molly, softly. "Oh, dear, I had better go. But you see, no one ever loved me like you, and I think your father, doesn't he, Molly? And it's hard to be driven out." "Cynthia, I am sure you're not well, or else you're not half awake." Cynthia sat with her arms encircling her knees and looking at vacancy. "Well," said she, at last, heaving a great sigh, but then smiling as she caught Molly's anxious face, "I suppose there's no escaping one's doom, and anywhere else I should be much more forlorn and unprotected." "What do you mean by your doom?" "Ah, that's telling, little one," said Cynthia, who seemed now to have recovered her usual manner. "I don't mean to have one, though. I think that, though I am an arrant coward at heart, I can show fight." "With whom?" asked Molly, really anxious to probe the mystery, if indeed there was one, to the bottom, in the hope of some remedy being found for the distress Cynthia was in when first Molly had entered. Again Cynthia was lost in thought. Then, catching the echo of Molly's last words in her mind, she said, "With whom? Oh, show fight with whom? With my doom, to be sure. Am I not a grand young lady to have a doom? Why, Molly, child, how pale and grave you look!" said she, kissing her all of a sudden. "You ought not to care so much for me. I'm not good enough for you to worry yourself about me. I've given myself up a long time ago as a heartless baggage." "Nonsense! I wish you wouldn't talk so, Cynthia. And I wish you wouldn't always take me at the foot of the letter, as an English girl at school used to translate it. Oh, how hot it is! Is it never going to get cool again? My child, what dirty hands you've got, and face too, and I've been kissing you. I daresay I'm dirty with it too. Now isn't that like one of mamma's speeches? For all that, you look more like a delving Adam than a spinning Eve." This had the effect that Cynthia intended. The daintily clean Molly became conscious of her soiled condition, which she had forgotten while she had been attending to Cynthia, and she hastily withdrew to her own room. When she had gone, Cynthia noiselessly locked the door, and taking her purse out of her desk, she began to count over her money. She counted it once, she counted it twice, as if desirous of finding out some mistake which should prove it to be more than it was, but the end of it all was a sigh. "What a fool, what a fool I was!" she said at length. "But even if I don't go out as a governess, I shall make it up in time." Some weeks after the time he had anticipated when he had spoken of his departure to the Gibsons, Roger returned back to the Hall. One morning when he called, Osborne told them that his brother had been at home for 2 or 3 days. "And why has he not come here, then?" said Mrs. Gibson. "It is not kind of him not to come and see us as soon as he can. Tell him I say so, pray do." Osborne had gained 1 or 2 ideas as to her treatment of Roger the last time he had called. Roger had not complained of it, or even mentioned it, till that very morning, when Osborne was on the point of starting, and he had urged Roger to accompany him. The latter had told him something of what Mrs. Gibson had said. He spoke rather as if he was more amused than annoyed. But Osborne could read that he was chagrined at those restrictions placed upon calls which were the greatest pleasure of his life. Neither of them let out the suspicion which had entered both their minds, the well-grounded suspicion arising from the fact that Osborne's visits, be they paid early or late, had never yet been met with a repulse. Osborne now reproached himself with having done Mrs. Gibson injustice. She was evidently a weak, but probably a disinterested woman, and it was only a little bit of ill temper on her part which had caused her to speak to Roger as she had done. "I daresay it was rather impertinent of me to call at such an untimely hour," said Roger. "Not at all. I call at all hours, and nothing is ever said about it. It was just because she was put out that morning. I'll answer for it she's sorry now, and I'm sure you may go there at any time you like in the future." Still Roger did not choose to go again for 2 or 3 weeks, and the consequence was that the next time he called the ladies were out. Once again he had the same ill luck, and then he received a little pretty 3-cornered note from Mrs. Gibson. "My dear Sir, how is it that you have become so formal all of a sudden, leaving cards instead of awaiting our return? Fie for shame! If you had seen the faces of disappointment that I did when the horrid little bits of pasteboard were displayed to our view, you would not have borne malice against me so long, for it is really punishing others as well as my naughty self. If you will come to morrow as early as you like and lunch with us, I'll own I was cross, and acknowledge myself a penitent. Yours ever, Hyacinth C.K. Gibson." There was no resisting this, even if there had not been strong inclination to back up the pretty words. Roger went, and Mrs. Gibson caressed and petted him in her sweetest, silkiest manner. Cynthia looked lovelier than ever to him for the slight restriction that had been laid for a time on their intercourse. She might be gay and sparkling with Osborne; with Roger she was soft and grave. Instinctively she knew her men. She saw that Osborne was only interested in her because of her position in a family with whom he was intimate, that his friendship was without the least touch of sentiment, and that his admiration was only the warm criticism of an artist for unusual beauty. But she felt how different Roger's relation to her was. To him she was the one, alone, peerless. If his love was prohibited, it would be long years before he could sink down into tepid friendship; and to him her personal loveliness was only one of the many charms that made him tremble into passion. Cynthia was not capable of returning such feelings. She had had too little true love in her life, and perhaps too much admiration to do so; but she appreciated this honest ardour, this loyal worship, that was new to her experience. Such appreciation and such respect for his true and affectionate nature gave a serious tenderness to her manner to Roger, which allured him with a fresh and separate grace. Molly sat by, and wondered how it would all end, or rather how soon it would all end, for she thought that no girl could resist such reverent passion. And on Roger's side there could be no doubt, alas! there could be no doubt. An older spectator might have looked far ahead and thought of the question of pounds, shillings, and pence. Where was the necessary income for a marriage to come from? Roger had his fellowship now, it is true, but the income of that would be lost if he married. He had no profession, and the life interest of the 2,000 or 3,000 pounds that he inherited from his mother belonged to his father. This older spectator might have been a little surprised at the empressement of Mrs. Gibson's manner to a younger son, always supposing this said spectator to have read to the depths of her worldly heart. Never had she tried to be more agreeable to Osborne, and though her attempt was a great failure when practised upon Roger, and he did not know what to say in reply to the delicate flatteries which he felt to be insincere, he saw that she intended him to consider himself henceforth free of the house, and he was too glad to avail himself of this privilege to examine over closely into what might be her motives for her change of manner. He shut his eyes and chose to believe that she was now desirous of making up for her little burst of temper on his previous visit. The result of Osborne's conference with the two doctors had been certain prescriptions which appeared to have done him much good, and which would, in all probability, have done him yet more, could he have been free of the recollection of the little patient wife in her solitude near Winchester. He went to her whenever he could, and, thanks to Roger, money was far more plentiful with him now than it had been. But he still shrank, and perhaps even more and more, from telling his father of his marriage. Some bodily instinct made him dread all agitation inexpressibly. If he had not had this money from Roger, he might have been compelled to tell his father all, and to ask for the necessary funds to provide for the wife and the coming child. But with enough in hand, and a secret, though remorseful, conviction that as long as Roger had a penny, his brother was sure to have half of it, made him more reluctant than ever to irritate his father by a revelation of his secret. "Not just yet, not just at present," he kept saying both to Roger and to himself. "By and by, if we have a boy, I will call it Roger." And then visions of poetical and romantic reconciliations brought about between father and son through the medium of a child, the offspring of a forbidden marriage, became still more vividly possible to him. And at any rate it was a staving off of an unpleasant thing. He atoned to himself for taking so much of Roger's fellowship money by reflecting that, if Roger married, he would lose this source of revenue. Yet Osborne was throwing no impediment in the way of this event, rather forwarding it by promoting every possible means of his brother's seeing the lady of his love. Osborne ended his reflections by convincing himself of his own generosity. Chapter 29.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Caitlin Sticko, Madison, Wisconsin, 2007. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 30. Old Ways and New Ways. Mr. Preston was now installed in his new house at Hollingford, Mr. Sheepshanks having entered into dignified idleness at the house of his married daughter, who lived in the county town. His successor had plunged with energy into all manner of improvements, and among others he fell to draining a piece of outlying waste and unreclaimed land of Lord Cumnor's, which was close to Squire Hamley's property, that very piece for which he had had the government grant, but which now lay neglected, and only half drained, with stacks of mossy tiles and lines of upturned furrows telling of abortive plans. It was not often that the squire rode in this direction nowadays, but the cottage of a man who had been the squire's gamekeeper in those more prosperous days when the Hamleys could afford to preserve, was close to the rush-grown ground. This old servant and tenant was ill, and had sent a message up to the Hall, asking to see the squire, not to reveal any secret, or to say anything particular, but only from the feudal loyalty which made it seem to the dying man as if it would be a comfort to shake the hand and look once more into the eyes of the lord and master whom he had served, and whose ancestors his own forebears had served for so many generations. And the squire was as fully alive as old Silas to the claims of the tie that existed between them, though he hated the thought, and still more should hate the sight of the piece of land, on the side of which Silas's cottage stood. The squire ordered his horse, and rode off within half an hour of receiving the message. As he drew near the spot, he thought he heard the sound of tools, and the hum of many voices, just as he had used to hear them a year or two before. He listened with surprise. Yes, instead of the still solitude he had expected, there was the clink of iron, the heavy gradual thud of the fall of barrows full of soil, the cry and shout of labourers. But not on his land, better worth expense and trouble by far than the reedy clay common on which the men were, in fact, employed. He knew it was Lord Cumnor's property, and he knew Lord Cumnor and his family had gone up in the world, the Whig rascals, both in wealth and in station, as the Hamleys had gone down. But all the same, in spite of long-known facts, and in spite of reason, the Squire's ready anger rose high at the sight of his neighbour doing what he had been unable to do, and he a Whig, and his family only in the country since Queen Anne's time. He went so far as to wonder whether they might not, the labourers he meant, avail themselves of his tiles, lying so conveniently close to hand. All these thoughts and regrets and wonders were in his mind as he rode up to the cottage he was bound to, and gave his horse in charge to a little lad, who had hitherto found his morning's business and amusement in playing at houses with a still younger sister, with some of the Squire's neglected tiles. But he was old Silas's grandson, and he might have battered the rude red earthenware to pieces, a whole stack, one by one, and the Squire would have said little or nothing. It was only that he would not spare one to a labourer of Lord Cumnor's. No, not one. Old Silas lay in a sort of closet, opening out of the family living-room. The small window that gave it light looked right on to the moor, as it was called, and by day the check curtain was drawn aside so that he might watch the progress of the labour. Everything about the old man was clean, if coarse, and, with death, the leveller, so close at hand, it was the labourer who made the first advances, and put out his horny hand to the Squire. "I thought you'd come, Squire. Your father came for to see my father, as he lay a-dying." "Come, come, my man," said the Squire, easily affected, as he always was. "Don't talk of dying. We shall soon have you out, never fear. They've sent you up some soup from the Hall, as I bade 'em, haven't they?" "Ay, ay. I've had all I could want for to eat and to drink. The young Squire and Master Roger was here yesterday." "Yes, I know." "I'm a deal nearer heaven to-day, I am. I should like you to look after the covers in the west spiney, Squire. Them gorse, you know, where the old fox had her hole, her as give 'em so many a run. You'll mind it, Squire, though you is but a lad. I could laugh to think on her tricks yet." And with a weak attempt at a laugh, he got himself into a violent fit of coughing, which alarmed the Squire, who thought he would never get his breath again. His daughter-in-law came in at the sound, and told the Squire that he had these coughing bouts very frequently, and that she thought he would go off in one of them before long. This opinion of hers was spoken simply out before the old man, who now lay gasping and exhausted upon his pillow. Poor people acknowledge the inevitableness and the approach of death in a much more straightforward manner than is customary among more educated folks. The Squire was shocked at the hard-heartedness, as he considered it; but the old man himself had received much tender kindness in action from his daughter-in-law, and what she had just said was no more news to him than the fact that the sun would rise to-morrow. He was more anxious to go on with his story. "Them navvies, I call 'em navvies because some of 'em is strangers, though some of 'em is the men we turned off on your own work, Squire, when there came orders to stop 'em last fall. They're a-pulling up gorse and brush to light their fire for warming up their messes. It's a long way off to their homes, and they mostly dine here, and there'll be nothing of a cover left if you don't see after 'em. I thought I should like to tell ye afore I died. Parson's been here, but I didna tell him. He's all for the Earl's folk, and he'd not a heeded. It's the Earl as put him into his church, I reckon, for he said what a fine thing it were for to see so much employment a-given to the poor, and he never said nought o' the sort when your works were agate, Squire." This long speech had been interrupted by many a cough and gasp for breath, and having delivered himself of what was on his mind, he turned his face to the wall, and appeared to be going to sleep. Presently he roused himself with a start. "I know I flogged him well, I did, but he were after pheasant's eggs, and I didn't know he were an orphan. Lord forgive me." "He's thinking on David Morton, the cripple as used to go about trapping vermin," whispered the woman. "Why, he died long ago, 20 year, I should think," replied the Squire. "Ay, but when grandfather goes off i' this way to sleep after a bout of talking, he seems to be dreaming on old times. He'll not waken up yet, sir. You'd best sit down if you'd like to stay," she continued, as she went into the house place and dusted a chair with her apron. "He was very particular in bidding me wake him if he were asleep, and you or Mr. Roger was to call. Mr. Roger said he'd be coming again this morning, but he'll likely sleep an hour or more if he's let alone." "I wish I'd said good-bye. I should have liked to done that." "He drops off so sudden," said the woman. "But if you'd better be pleased to have said it, Squire, I'll waken him up a bit." "No, no," the Squire called out, as the woman was going to be as good as her word. "I'll come again, perhaps to-morrow, and tell him I was sorry, for I am indeed, and be sure to send to the Hall for anything you want. Mr. Roger is coming, is he? He'll bring me word how he is, later on. I should like to have bidden him good-bye." So, giving sixpence to the child who had held his horse, the Squire mounted. He sat still a moment, looking at the busy work going on before him, and then at his own half-completed drainage. It was a bitter pill. He had objected to borrowing from the government in the first instance, and then his wife had persuaded him to the step, and after it was once taken, he was as proud as could be of the only concession to the spirit of progress he had ever made in his life. He had read and studied the subject pretty thoroughly, if also very slowly, during the time his wife had been influencing him. He was tolerably well up in agriculture, if in nothing else, and at one time he had taken the lead among the neighbouring landowners, when he had first began tiled drainage. In those days people used to speak of Squire Hamley's hobby, and at market ordinaries or country dinners they rather dreaded setting him off on long repetitions of arguments from the different pamphlets on the subject which he had read. And now the proprietors all around him were draining. His interest to government was running on all the same, though his works were stopped, and his tiles deteriorating in value. It was not a soothing consideration, and the Squire was almost ready to quarrel with his shadow. He wanted a vent for his ill humour, and suddenly remembering the devastation on his covers, which he had heard about not a quarter of an hour before, he rode up to the men busy at work on Lord Cumnor's land. Just before he got up to them, he encountered Mr. Preston, also on horseback, come to overlook his labourers. The Squire did not know him personally, but from the agent's manner of speaking, and the deference that was evidently paid to him, Mr. Hamley saw that he was a responsible person. So he addressed the agent. "I beg your pardon, but I suppose you are the manager of these works?" Mr. Preston replied, "Certainly. I am that, and many other things besides, at your service. I have succeeded Mr. Sheepshanks in the management of my lord's property. Mr. Hamley of Hamley, I believe?" The Squire bowed stiffly. He did not like his name to be asked or presumed upon in that manner. An equal might conjecture who he was, or recognise him, but till he announced himself, an inferior had no right to do more than address him respectfully as Sir. That was the Squire's code of etiquette. "I am Mr. Hamley of Hamley. I suppose you are as yet ignorant of the boundary of Lord Cumnor's land, so I will inform you that my property begins at the pond yonder, just where you see the rise in the ground." "I am perfectly acquainted with that fact, Mr. Hamley," said Mr. Preston, a little annoyed at the ignorance attributed to him. "But may I inquire why my attention is called to it just now?" The Squire was beginning to boil over, but he tried to keep his temper in. The effort was very much to be respected, for it was a great one. There was something in the handsome and well-dressed agent's tone and manner inexpressibly irritating to the Squire, and it was not lessened by an involuntary comparison of the capital roadster on which Mr. Preston was mounted, with his own ill-groomed and aged cob. "I have been told that your men out yonder do not respect these boundaries, but are in the habit of plucking up gorse from my covers to light their fires." "It is possible they may," said Mr. Preston, lifting his eyebrows, his manner being more nonchalant than his words. "I daresay they think no great harm of it. However, I'll inquire." "Do you doubt my word, sir?" said the Squire, fretting his mare till she began to dance about. "I tell you I've heard it only within this last half hour." "I don't doubt your word, Mr. Hamley. It's the last thing I should think of doing. But you must excuse my saying that the argument which you have twice brought up for the authenticity of your statement, that you have heard it within the last half hour, is not quite so forcible as to preclude the possibility of a mistake." "I wish you'd only say in plain language that you doubt my word," said the Squire, clenching and slightly raising his horsewhip. "I can't make out what you mean, you use so many words." "Pray don't lose your temper, sir. I said I should inquire. You have not seen the men pulling up gorse yourself, or you would have named it. I surely may doubt the correctness of your informant until I have made some inquiry. At any rate, that is the course I shall pursue, and if it gives you offence I shall be sorry, but I shall do it just the same. When I am convinced that harm has been done to your property, I shall take steps to prevent it for the future, and of course, in my lord's name, I shall pay you compensation. It may probably amount to £50." He added these last words in a lower tone, as if to himself, with a slight contemptuous smile on his face. "Quiet, mare, quiet!" said the Squire, quite unaware that he was the cause of her impatient movements by the way he was perpetually tightening her reins, and also, perhaps, he unconsciously addressed the injunction to himself. Neither of them saw Roger Hamley, who was just then approaching them with long steady steps. He had seen his father from the door of old Silas's cottage, and as the poor fellow was still asleep, he was coming to speak to his father, and was near enough now to hear the words. "I don't know who you are, but I've known land agents who were gentlemen, and I've known some who were not. You belong to this last set, young man," said the Squire. "That you do. I should like to try my horsewhip on you for your insolence." "Pray, Mr. Hamley," replied Mr. Preston, coolly, "curb your temper a little, and reflect. I really feel sorry to see a man of your age in such a passion." Moving a little farther off, however, but really more with a desire to save the irritated man from carrying his threat into execution, out of a dislike to the slander and excitement it would cause, than from any personal dread. Just at this moment Roger Hamley came close up. He was panting a little, and his eyes were very stern and dark. But he spoke quietly enough. "Mr. Preston, I can hardly understand what you mean by your last words. But remember, my father is a gentleman of age and position, and not accustomed to receive advice as to the management of his temper from young men like you." "I desired to keep his men off my land," said the Squire to his son, his wish to stand well in Roger's opinion restraining his temper a little. But though his words might be a little calmer, there were all other signs of passion present, the discoloured complexion, the trembling hands, the fiery cloud in his eyes. "He refused, and doubted my word." Mr. Preston turned to Roger, as if appealing from Philip drunk to Philip sober, and spoke in a tone of cool explanation, which, though not insolent in words, was excessively irritating in manner. "Your father has misunderstood me. Perhaps it is no wonder," trying to convey, by a look of intelligence at the son, his opinion that the father was in no state to hear reason. "I never refused to do what was just and right. I only required further evidence as to the past wrong-doing. Your father took offence at this." And then he shrugged his shoulders, and lifted his eyebrows in a manner he had formerly learnt in France. "At any rate, sir, I can scarcely reconcile the manner and words to my father which I heard you use when I first came up, with the deference you ought to have shown to a man of his age and position. As to the fact of the trespass—" "They're pulling up all the gorse, Roger. There'll be no cover whatever for game soon," put in the Squire. Roger bowed to his father, but took up his speech at the point it was before the interruption. "I will inquire into it myself at a cooler moment; and if I find that such trespass or damage has been committed, of course I shall expect that you will see it put a stop to. Come, father, I am going to see old Silas. Perhaps you don't know that he is very ill." So he endeavoured to wile the Squire away to prevent further words. He was not entirely successful. Mr. Preston was enraged by Roger's calm and dignified manner, and threw after them this parting shaft in the shape of a loud soliloquy. "Position, indeed! What are we to think of the position of a man who begins works like these without counting the cost, and comes to a standstill, and has to turn off his labourers just at the beginning of winter, leaving—" They were too far off to hear the rest. The Squire was on the point of turning back before this, but Roger took hold of the reins of the old mare, and led her over some of the boggy ground, as if to guide her into sure footing, but in reality because he was determined to prevent the renewal of the quarrel. It was well that the cob knew him, and was, indeed, old enough to prefer quietness to dancing, for Mr. Hamley plucked hard at the reins, and at last broke out with an oath, "Damn it, Roger! I'm not a child. I won't be treated as such. Leave go, I say." Roger let go. They were not on firm ground, and he did not wish any watchers to think that he was exercising any constraint over his father, and this quiet obedience to his impatient commands did more to soothe the Squire than anything else could have effected just then. "I know I turned them off. What could I do? I'd no more money for their weekly wages. It's a loss to me, as you know. He doesn't know. No one knows. But I think your mother would. How it cut me to turn 'em off just before winter set in! I lay awake many a night thinking of it, and I gave them what I had. I did indeed. I hadn't got money to pay 'em, but I had 3 barren cows fattened, and I gave 'em every scrap of meat to the men. I let 'em go into the woods and gather what was fallen, and I winked at their breaking off old branches. And now to have it cast up against me by that cur, that servant! But I'll go on with the works, I will, if only to spite him. I'll show him who I am. My position, indeed! A Hamley of Hamleys takes a higher position than his master. I'll go on with the works, see if I don't. I'm paying between 100 and 200 a year interest on government money. I'll raise some more if I go to the Jews. Osbourne has shown me the way, and Osbourne shall pay for it, he shall. I'll not put up with insults. You shouldn't have stopped me, Roger. I wish to heaven I'd horsewhip the fellow." He was lashing himself again into an impotent rage, painful to a son to witness, but just then the little grandchild of old Silas, who had held the Squire's horse during his visit to the sick man, came running up, breathless. "Please, sir, please, Squire, Mammy's sent me. Grandfather had wakened up suddenly, and Mammy says he's dying, and would you please come? She says he'd take it as a kind compliment, she's sure." So they went to the cottage, the Squire speaking never a word, but suddenly feeling as if lifted out of a whirlwind, and set down in a still and awful place. End of chapter 30. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 31. A Passive Coquette. It is not to be supposed that such an encounter as Mr. Preston had just had with Roger Hamley sweetened the regards in which the two young men henceforward held each other. They had barely spoken to each other before, and but seldom met, for the land agent's employment had hitherto lain at Ashcombe, some 16 or 17 miles from Hamley. He was older than Roger by several years, but during the time he had been in the county, Osborne and Roger had been at school and at college. Mr. Preston was prepared to dislike the Hamleys for many unreasonable reasons. Cynthia and Molly had both spoken of the brothers with familiar regard, implying considerable intimacy. Their flowers had been preferred to his on the occasion of the ball. Most people spoke well of them, and Mr. Preston had an animal's instinctive jealousy and combativeness against all popular young men. Their position, poor as the Hamleys might be, was far higher than his own in the county, and moreover he was agent to the great Whig lord, whose political interests were diametrically opposed to those of the old Tory squire. Not that Lord Cumnor troubled himself much about his political interests. His family had obtained property and title from the Whigs at the time of the Hanoverian succession, and so, traditionally, he was a Whig, and had belonged in his youth to Whig clubs, where he had lost considerable sums of money to Whig gamblers. All this was satisfactory and consistent enough; and if Lord Hollingford had not been returned for the county on the Whig interest, as his father had been before him, until he had succeeded to the title, it is quite probable Lord Cumnor would have considered the British Constitution in danger, and the patriotism of his ancestors ungratefully ignored. But, excepting at elections, he had no notion of making Whig and Tory a party cry. He had lived too much in London, and was of too sociable a nature, to exclude any man who jumped with his humour from the hospitality he was always ready to offer, be the agreeable acquaintance Whig, Tory, or Radical. But in the county of which he was Lord Lieutenant, the old party distinction was still a shibboleth by which men were tested for their fitness for social intercourse, as well as on the hustings. If by any chance a Whig found himself at a Tory dinner table, or vice versa, the food was hard of digestion, the wine and viands were criticised rather than enjoyed. A marriage between young people of the separate parties was almost as unheard of and prohibited an alliance as that of Romeo and Juliet's. And of course Mr. Preston was not a man in whose breast such prejudices would die away. They were an excitement to him, for one thing, and called out all his talent for intrigue on behalf of the party to which he was allied. Moreover, he considered it as loyalty to his employer to scatter his enemies by any means in his power. He had always hated and despised the Tories in general, and after that interview on the marshy common in front of Silas's cottage, he hated the Hamleys and Roger especially, with a very choice and particular hatred. "That prig," as hereafter he always designated Roger, "he shall pay for it yet," he said to himself, by way of consolation, after the father and son had left him. "What a lout he is!" watching the receding figure. "The old chap has twice as much spunk," as the Squire tugged at his bridle reins. "The old mare could make her way better without being led, my fine fellow. But I see through your dodge. You're afraid of your old father turning back and getting into another rage. Position, indeed! A beggarly squire! A man who did turn off his men just before winter to rot or starve, for all he cared. It's just like a brutal old Tory." And under the cover of his sympathy with the dismissed labourers, Mr. Preston indulged his own private pique very pleasantly. Mr. Preston had many causes for rejoicing. He might have forgotten this discomfiture, as he chose to feel it, in the remembrance of an increase of income, and in the popularity he enjoyed in his new abode. All Hollingford came forward to do the Earl's new agent honour. Mr. Sheepshanks had been a crabbed, crusty old bachelor, frequenting inn-parlours on market days, not unwilling to give dinners to 3 or 4 chosen friends and familiars, with whom, in return, he dined from time to time, and with whom, also, he kept up an amicable rivalry in the matter of wines. But he "did not appreciate female society," as Miss Browning elegantly worded his unwillingness to accept the invitations of the Hollingford ladies. He was unrefined enough to speak of these invitations to his intimate friends aforesaid in the following manner: "Those old women's worrying. But, of course, they never heard of this. Little quarter-of-sheet notes without any envelopes that invention was unknown in those days, but sealed in at the corners when folded up, instead of gummed as they are fastened at present, occasionally passed between Mr. Sheepshanks and the Miss Brownings, Mrs. Goodenough, or others. In the first instance, the form ran as follows: Miss Browning and her sister, Miss Phoebe Browning, present their respectful compliments to Mr. Sheepshanks, and beg to inform him that a few friends have kindly consented to favour them with their company at tea on Thursday next. Miss Browning and Miss Phoebe will take it very kindly if Mr. Sheepshanks will join their little circle. Now for Mrs. Goodenough. Mrs. Goodenough's respects to Mr. Sheepshanks, and hopes he is in good health. She would be very glad if he would favour her with his company to tea on Monday. My daughter in Combermere has sent me a couple of guinea fowls, and Mrs. Goodenough hopes Mr. Sheepshanks will stay and take a bit of supper. No need for the dates of the days of the month. The good ladies would have thought that the world was coming to an end if the invitation had been sent out a week before the party therein named. But not even guinea fowls for supper could tempt Mr. Sheepshanks. He remembered the made wines he had tasted in former days at Hollingford parties, and shuddered. Bread and cheese, with a glass of bitter beer, or a little brandy and water, partaken of in his old clothes, which had worn into shapes of loose comfort and smelt strongly of tobacco, he liked better than roast guinea fowl and birch wine, even without throwing into the balance the stiff uneasy coat and the tight neckcloth and tighter shoes. So the ex-agent had been seldom, if ever, seen at the Hollingford tea-parties. He might have had his form of refusal stereotyped, it was so invariably the same. Mr. Sheepshanks' duty to Miss Browning and her sister, to Mrs. Goodenough, or to others, as the case might be. Business of importance prevents him from availing himself of their polite invitation, for which he begs to return his best thanks. But now that Mr. Preston had succeeded and come to live in Hollingford, things were changed. He accepted every civility, right and left, and won golden opinions accordingly. Parties were made in his honour, just as if he had been a bride, Miss Phoebe Browning said, and to all of them he went. "What's a man after?" said Mr. Sheepshanks to himself, when he heard of his successor's affability and sociability and amiability, and a variety of other agreeable illities from the friends whom the old steward still retained at Hollingford. "Preston's not a man to put himself out for nothing. He's deep. He'll be after something solider than popularity." The sagacious old bachelor was right. Mr. Preston was after something more than mere popularity. He went wherever he had a chance of meeting Cynthia Kirkpatrick. It might be that Molly's spirits were more depressed at this time than they were in general, or that Cynthia was exultant unawares to herself in the amount of attention and admiration she was receiving from Roger by day, from Mr. Preston in the evenings, but the two girls seemed to have parted company in cheerfulness. Molly was always gentle, but very grave and silent. Cynthia, on the contrary, was merry, full of pretty mockeries, and hardly ever silent. When first she came to Hollingford, one of her great charms had been that she was such a gracious listener. Now her excitement, by whatever caused, made her too restless to hold her tongue. Yet what she said was too pretty, too witty, not to be a winning and sparkling interruption, eagerly welcomed by those who were under her sway. Mr. Gibson was the only one who observed this change, and reasoned upon it. "She is in a mental fever of some kind," thought he to himself. "She is very fascinating, but I don't quite understand her." If Molly had not been so entirely loyal to her friend, she might have thought this constant brilliancy a little tiresome when brought into everyday life. It was not the sunshiny rest of a placid lake. It was rather the glitter of the pieces of a broken mirror, which confuses and bewilders. Cynthia would not talk quietly about anything now. Subjects of thought or conversation seemed to have lost their relative value. There were exceptions to this mood of hers, when she sank into deep fits of silence, that would have been gloomy had it not been for the never varying sweetness of her temper. If there was a little kindness to be done to either Mr. Gibson or Molly, Cynthia was just as ready as ever to do it; nor did she refuse to do anything her mother wished, however fidgety might be the humour that prompted the wish. But in this latter case Cynthia's eyes were not quickened by her heart. Molly was dejected, she knew not why. Cynthia had drifted a little apart; that was not it. Her stepmother had whimsical moods, and if Cynthia displeased her, she would oppress Molly with small kindnesses and pseudo affection. Or else everything was wrong, the world was out of joint, and Molly had failed in her mission to set it right, and was to be blamed accordingly. But Molly was of too steady a disposition to be moved much by the changeableness of an unreasonable person. She might be annoyed or irritated, but she was not depressed. That was not it. The real cause was certainly this: as long as Roger was drawn to Cynthia, and sought her of his own accord, it had been a sore pain and bewilderment to Molly's heart; but it was a straightforward attraction, and one which Molly acknowledged, in her humility and great power of loving, to be the most natural thing in the world. She would look at Cynthia's beauty and grace, and feel as if no one could resist it. And when she witnessed all the small signs of honest devotion which Roger was at no pains to conceal, she thought, with a sigh, that surely no girl could help relinquishing her heart to such a tender, strong keeper as Roger's character ensured. She would have been willing to cut off her right hand if need were to forward his attachment to Cynthia, and the self-sacrifice would have added a strange zest to a happy crisis. She was indignant at what she considered to be Mrs. Gibson's obtuseness to so much goodness and worth; and when she called Roger a country lout, or any other depreciative epithet, Molly would pinch herself in order to keep silent. But after all, those were peaceful days compared to the present, when she, seeing the wrong side of the tapestry, after the wont of those who dwell in the same house with a plotter, became aware that Mrs. Gibson had totally changed her behaviour to Roger, from some cause unknown to Molly. But he was always exactly the same, "steady as old Time," as Mrs. Gibson called him, with her usual originality. "A rock of strength, under whose very shadow there is rest," as Mrs. Hamley had once spoken of him. So the cause of Mrs. Gibson's altered manner lay not in him. Yet now he was sure of a welcome, let him come at any hour that he would. He was playfully reproved for having taken Mrs. Gibson's words too literally, and for never coming before lunch; but he said he considered her reasons for such words to be valid, and should respect them; and this was done out of his simplicity, from no tinge of malice. And then, in their family conversations at home, Mrs. Gibson was constantly making projects for throwing Roger and Cynthia together, with so evident a betrayal of her wish to bring about an engagement, that Molly chafed at the net spread so evidently, and at Roger's blindness in coming so willingly to be entrapped. She forgot his previous willingness, his former evidences of manly fondness for the beautiful Cynthia. She only saw plots, of which he was the victim, and Cynthia the conscious if passive bait. She felt as if she could not have acted as Cynthia did; no, not even to gain Roger's love. Cynthia heard and saw as much of the domestic background as she did, and yet she submitted to the rôle assigned to her. To be sure, this rôle would have been played by her unconsciously; the things prescribed were what she would naturally have done. But because they were prescribed, by implication only, it is true, Molly would have resisted, have gone out, for instance, when she was expected to stay at home, or have lingered in the garden when a long country walk was planned. At last, for she could not help loving Cynthia, come what would, she determined to believe that Cynthia was entirely unaware of all; but it was with an effort that she brought herself to believe it. It may be all very pleasant to sport with Amaryllis in the shade, or with the tangles of Nerea's hair; but young men at the outset of their independent life have many other cares in this prosaic England to occupy their time and their thoughts. Roger was a fellow of Trinity, to be sure, and from the outside it certainly appeared as if his position, as long as he chose to keep unmarried, was a very easy one. His was not a nature, however, to sink down into inglorious ease, even had his fellowship income been at his disposal. He looked forward to an active life, in what direction he had not yet determined. He knew what were his talents and his tastes, and did not wish the former to lie buried, nor the latter, which he regarded as gifts, fitting him for some peculiar work, to be disregarded or thwarted. He rather liked awaiting an object, secure in his own energy to force his way to it, when he once saw it clearly. He reserved enough of his money for his own personal needs, which were small, and for the ready furtherance of any project he might see fit to undertake. The rest of his income was to Osborne's, given and accepted in the spirit which made the bond between those two brothers so rarely perfect. It was only the thought of Cynthia that threw Roger off his balance. A strong man in everything else, about her he was as a child. He knew that he could not marry and retain his fellowship. His intention was to hold himself loose from any employment or profession until he had found one to his mind, so there was no immediate prospect, no prospect for many years indeed, that he would be able to marry. Yet he went on seeking Cynthia's sweet company, listening to the music of her voice, basking in her sunshine, and feeding his passion in every possible way, just like an unreasoning child. He knew that it was folly, and yet he did it, and it was perhaps this that made him so sympathetic with Osborne. Roger racked his brains about Osborne's affairs much more frequently than Osborne troubled himself. Indeed, he had become so ailing and languid of late, that even the Squire made only very faint objections to his desire for frequent change of scene, though formerly he used to grumble so much at the necessary expenditure it involved. "After all, it does not cost much," the Squire said to Roger one day. "Choose how he does it cheaply. He used to come and ask me for 20, whereas now he does it for 5. But he and I have lost each other's language. That's what we have, and my dictionary," only he called it dictionary, "has got all wrong because of those confounded debts, which he will never explain to me, or talk about. He always holds me off at arm's length when I begin upon it. He does, Roger, me, his old dad, as was his primest favourite of all when he was a little bit of a chap." The Squire dwelt so much upon Osborne's reserved behaviour to himself, that, brooding over this subject perpetually, he became more morose and gloomy than ever in his manner to Osborne, resenting the want of the confidence and affection that he thus repelled. So much so that Roger, who desired to avoid being made the receptacle of his father's complaints against Osborne, and Roger's passive listening was the sedative his father always sought, had often to have recourse to the discussion of the drainage works as a counter-irritant. The Squire had felt Mr. Preston's speech about the dismissal of his work-people very keenly. It fell in with the reproaches of his own conscience, though, as he would repeat to Roger over and over again, "I could not help it. How could I? I was drained dry of ready money. I wish the land was drained as dry as I am," said he, with a touch of humour that came out before he was aware, and at which he smiled sadly enough. "What was I to do, I ask you, Roger? I know I was in a rage. I've had a deal to make me so. And maybe I did not think as much about consequences as I should have done, when I gave the orders for 'em to be sent off. But I could not have done otherwise if I had thought for a 12-month in cool blood. Consequences! I hate consequences. They've always been on against me, they have. I'm so tied up I can't cut down a stick more, and that's a consequence of having the property so deucedly well settled. I wish I'd never had any ancestors. Ay, laugh, lad. It does me good to see thee laugh a bit, after Osborne's long face, which always grows longer at the sight of me." "Look here, father," said Roger suddenly. "I'll manage somehow about the money for the works. You trust to me. Give me 2 months to turn myself in, and you shall have some money, at any rate, to begin with." The Squire looked at him, and his face brightened as a child's does at the promise of a pleasure made to him by some one on whom he can rely. He became a little graver, however, as he said, "But how will you get it? It's hard enough work." "Never mind. I'll get it. 100 or so at first. I don't yet know how. But remember, father, I'm a senior wrangler, and a very promising young writer, as that review called me. Oh, you don't know what a fine fellow you've got for a son. You should read that review to know all my wonderful merits." "I did, Roger. I've heard Gibson speaking of it, and I made him get it for me. I should have understood it better if they could have called the animals by their English names, not put so much of their French jingo into it." "But it was an answer to an article by a French writer," pleaded Roger. "I'd ha' let him alone," said the Squire earnestly. "We had to beat 'em, and we did it at Waterloo. But I'd not demean myself by answering any of their lies if I was you. But I got through the review, for all their Latin and French I did. And if you doubt me, you'll just look at the end of the great ledger, turn it upside down, you'll find I've copied out all the fine words they said of you. Careful observer, strong nervous English, rising philosopher. Oh, I can nearly say it all off by heart, for many a times when I am frabbed by bad debts, or Osbourne's bills, or moidered with accounts, I turn the ledger the wrong way up, and smoke a pipe over it, while I read those pieces out of the review which speak about you, lad." End of chapter 31.
The LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Liz Thompson. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 32. Coming Events. Roger had turned over many plans in his mind, by which he thought that he could obtain sufficient money for the purpose he desired to accomplish. His careful grandfather, who had been a merchant in the city, had so tied up the few thousands he had left to his daughter, that although, in case of her death before her husband's, the latter might enjoy the life interest thereof, yet in case of both their deaths, their second son did not succeed to the property until he was 25, and if he died before that age, the money that would then have been his went to one of his cousins on the maternal side. In short, the old merchant had taken as many precautions about his legacy as if it had been for tens instead of units of thousands. Of course, Roger might have slipped through all these meshes by insuring his life until the specified age, and probably, if he had consulted any lawyer, this course would have been suggested to him. But he disliked taking any one into his confidence on the subject of his father's want of ready money. He had obtained a copy of his grandfather's will at Doctors' Commons, and he imagined that all the contingencies involved in it would be patent to the light of nature and common sense. He was a little mistaken in this, but not the less resolved that money in some way he would have, in order to fulfil his promise to his father, and for the ulterior purpose of giving the Squire some daily interest to distract his thoughts from the regrets and cares that were almost weakening his mind. It was Roger Hamley, senior wrangler and fellow of Trinity, to the highest bidder, no matter what honest employment, and presently it came down to any bidder at all. Another perplexity and distress at this time weighed upon Roger. Osbourne, heir to the estate, was going to have a child. The Hamley property was entailed on heirs male born in lawful wedlock. Was the wedlock lawful? Osbourne never seemed to doubt that it was, never seemed, in fact, to think twice about it. And if he, the husband, did not, how much less did Amy, the trustful wife? Yet who could tell how much misery any shadows of illegality might cast into the future? One evening, Roger, sitting by the languid, careless, dilettante Osbourne, began to question him as to the details of the marriage. Osbourne knew instinctively at what Roger was aiming. It was not that he did not desire perfect legality, in justice to his wife. It was that he was so indisposed at the time that he hated to be bothered. It was something like the refrain of Gray's Scandinavian prophetess, leave me to repose. But do try and tell me how you managed it." "How tiresome you are, Roger," put in Osbourne. "Well, I dare say I am. Go on." I've told you, Morrison married us. You remember old Morrison at Trinity? Yes, as good and blunder-headed a fellow as ever lived. Well, he's taken orders, and the examination for priest's orders fatigued him so much that he got his father to give him 100 or 2 for a tour on the continent. He meant to get to Rome, because he heard that there were such pleasant winters there, so he turned up at Metz in August. I don't see why. No more did he. He never was great in geography, you know, and somehow he thought that Metz, pronounced French fashion, must be on the road to Rome. Someone had told him so in fun. However, it was very well for me that I met with him there, for I was determined to be married, and that without loss of time. But Amy is a Catholic. That's true, but you see I am not. You don't suppose I would do her any wrong, Roger? Asked Osborne, sitting up in his lounging chair, and speaking rather indignantly to Roger, his face suddenly flushing red. No, I'm sure you would not mean it. But you see there's a child coming, and this estate is entailed on heirs male. Now I want to know if the marriage is legal or not, and it seems to me it's a ticklish question. Oh, said Osborne, falling back into repose, if that's all, I suppose you're next heir male, and I can trust you as I can myself. You know my marriage is bona fide in intention, and I believe it to be legal in fact. We went over to Strasbourg. Amy picked up a friend, a good middle-aged Frenchwoman, who served half as bridesmaid, half as chaperone, and then we went before the mayor, prefet, what do you call them? I think Morrison rather enjoyed the spree. I signed all manner of papers in the prefecture. I did not read them over, for fear lest I could not sign them conscientiously. It was the safest plan. Amy kept trembling, so I thought she would faint. And then we went off to the nearest English chaplaincy, Karlsruhe, and the chaplain was away, so Morrison easily got the loan of the chapel, and we were married the next day. But surely some registration or certificate was necessary. Morrison said he would undertake all those forms, and he ought to know his own business. I know I tipped him pretty well for the job. You must be married again, said Roger after a pause, and that before the child is born. Have you got a certificate of the marriage? I dare say Morrison has got it somewhere. But I believe I'm legally married, according to the laws both of England and France. I really do, old fellow. I've got the prefet's papers somewhere. Never mind. You shall be married again in England. Amy goes to the Roman Catholic chapel at Preston, does not she? Yes. She is so good. I would not disturb her in her religion for the world. Then you shall be married both there and at the church of the parish in which she lives as well, said Roger decidedly. It's a great deal of trouble. Unnecessary trouble and unnecessary expense, I should say, said Osborne. Why can't you leave well alone? Neither Amy nor I are of the sort of stuff to turn scoundrels and deny the legality of our marriage, and if the child is a boy and my father dies, and I die, why, I'm sure you'll do him justice, as sure as I am of myself, old fellow. But if I die into the bargain, make a hecatomb of the present Hamleys all at once while you're about it. Who succeeds as heir male? Osborne thought for a moment. One of the Irish Hamleys, I suppose. I fancy they are needy chaps. Perhaps you're right. But what need to have such gloomy forebodings? The law makes one have foresight in such affairs, said Roger. So I'll go down to Amy next week when I'm in town, and I'll make all necessary arrangements before you come. I think you'll be happier if it is all done. I shall be happier if I've a chance of seeing the little woman, that I grant you. But what is taking you up to town? I wish I'd money to run about like you, instead of being shut up forever in this dull old house. Osborne was apt occasionally to contrast his position with Roger's in a tone of complaint, forgetting that both were the results of character, and also that out of his income Roger gave up so large a portion for the maintenance of his brother's wife. But if this ungenerous thought of Osborne's had been set clearly before his conscience, he would have smote his breast and cried, mea culpa, with the best of them. It was only that he was too indolent to keep an unassisted conscience. I should not have thought of going up, said Roger, reddening as if he had been accused of spending another's money instead of his own, if I had not had to go up on business. Lord Hollingford has written for me. He knows my great wish for employment, and has heard of something which he considers suitable. There's his letter, if you care to read it, but it does not tell anything definitely. Osborne read the letter, and returned it to Roger. After a moment or two of silence, he said, Why do you want money? Are we taking too much from you? It's a great shame of me, but what can I do? Only suggest a career for me, and I'll follow it to-morrow." He spoke as if Roger had been reproaching him. "My dear fellow, don't get those notions into your head. I must do something for myself sometimes, and I have been on the look-out. Besides, I want my father to go on with his drainage. It would do good both to his health and his spirits. If I can advance any part of the money requisite, he and you shall pay me interest until you can return the capital." "Roger, you're the providence of the family!" exclaimed Osborne, suddenly struck by admiration at his brother's conduct, and forgetting to contrast it with his own. So Roger went up to London, and Osborne followed him, and for 2 or 3 weeks the Gibsons saw nothing of the brothers. But as wave succeeds to wave, so interest succeeds to interest. The family, as they were called, came down for their autumn sojourn at the Towers, and again the house was full of visitors, and the Towers' servants, and carriages, and liveries were seen in the 2 streets of Hollingford, just as they might have been seen for scores of autumns past. So runs the round of life from day to day. Mrs. Gibson found the chances of intercourse with the Towers rather more personally exciting than Roger's visits, or the rarer calls of Osborne Hamley. Cynthia had an old antipathy to the great family, who had made so much of her mother, and so little of her, and whom she considered as in some measure the cause why she had seen so little of her mother in the days when the little girl had craved for love and found none. Moreover, Cynthia missed her slave. Although she did not care for Roger 1,000th part of what he did for her, yet she had found it not unpleasant to have a man whom she thoroughly respected, and whom men in general respected, the subject of her eye, the glad ministrant to each scarce spoken wish, a person in whose sight all her words were pearls or diamonds, all her actions heavenly graciousness, and in whose thoughts she reigned supreme. She had no modest unconsciousness about her, and yet she was not vain. She knew of all this worship, and when from circumstances she no longer received it, she missed it. The Earl and the Countess, Lord Hollingford and Lady Harriet, lords and ladies in general, liveries, dresses, bags of game, and rumours of riding parties, were as nothing to her as compared to Roger's absence. And yet she did not love him. No, she did not love him. Molly knew that Cynthia did not love him. Molly grew angry with her many and many a time as the conviction of this fact was forced upon her. Molly did not know her own feelings. Roger had no overwhelming interest in what they might be, while his very life-breath seemed to depend on what Cynthia felt and thought. Therefore Molly had keen insight into her sister's heart, and she knew that Cynthia did not love Roger. Molly could have cried with passionate regret at the thought of the unvalued treasure lying at Cynthia's feet, and it would have been a merely unselfish regret. It was the old fervid tenderness. "Do not wish for the moon, O my darling, for I cannot give it thee." Cynthia's love was the moon Roger yearned for, and Molly saw that it was far away and out of reach, else would she have strained her heart cords to give it to Roger. "I am his sister," she would say to herself. "That old bond is not done away with, though he is too much absorbed by Cynthia to speak about it just now. His mother called me Fanny. It was almost like an adoption. I must wait and watch, and see if I can do anything for my brother." One day Lady Harriet came to call on the Gibsons, or rather on Mrs. Gibson, for the latter retained her old jealousy if any one else in Hollingford was supposed to be on intimate terms at the great house, or in the least acquainted with their plans. Mr. Gibson might possibly know as much, but then he was professionally bound to secrecy. Out of the house she considered Mr. Preston as her rival, and he was aware that she did so, and delighted in teasing her by affecting a knowledge of family plans and details of affairs of which she was not aware. Indoors she was jealous of the fancy Lady Harriet had evidently taken for her stepdaughter, and she contrived to place quiet obstacles in the way of a too frequent intercourse between the two. These obstacles were not unlike the shield of the knight in the old story, only, instead of the 2 sides presented to the 2 travellers approaching it from opposite quarters, one of which was silver and one of which was gold, Lady Harriet saw the smooth and shining yellow radiance, while poor Molly only perceived a dull and heavy lead. To Lady Harriet it was, "Molly is gone out. She will be so sorry to miss you, but she was obliged to go and see some old friends of her mother's, whom she ought not to neglect. As I said to her, constancy is everything. It is Sterne, I think, who says, 'Thine own and thy mother's friends forsake not.' But, dear Lady Harriet, you'll stop till she comes home, won't you? I know how fond you are of her. In fact," with a little surface playfulness, "I sometimes say you come more to see her than your poor old Clare." To Molly it had previously been, "Lady Harriet is coming here this morning. I can't have any one else coming in. Tell Maria to say I'm not at home. Lady Harriet has always so much to tell me. Dear Lady Harriet, I've known all her secrets since she was 12 years old. You two girls must keep out of the way. Of course she'll ask for you, out of common civility, but you would only interrupt us if you came in, as you did the other day," now addressing Molly. "I hardly like to say so, but I thought it was very forward." "Maria told me she had asked for me," put in Molly simply. "Very forward indeed," continued Mrs. Gibson, taking no further notice of the interruption, except to strengthen the words, to which Molly's little speech had been intended as a correction. "I think this time I must secure her ladyship from the chances of such an intrusion, by taking care that you are out of the house, Molly. You had better go to the Holly Farm, and speak about those damsons I ordered, and which have never been sent." "I'll go," said Cynthia. "It's far too long a walk for Molly. She's had a bad cold, and is not as strong as she was a fortnight ago. I delight in long walks. If you want Molly out of the way, mamma, send her to the Miss Brownings. They are always glad to see her." "I never said I wanted Molly out of the way, Cynthia," replied Mrs. Gibson. "You always put things in such an exaggerated, I should almost say so coarse a manner. I am sure, Molly, my love, you could never have so misunderstood me. It is only on Lady Harriet's account." "I don't think I can walk as far as the Holly Farm. Papa would take the message. Cynthia need not go." "Well, I'm the last person in the world to tax any one's strength. I'd sooner never see damson preserve again. Suppose you do go and see Miss Browning. You can pay her a nice long call, you know she likes that, and ask after Miss Phoebe's cold from me, you know. They were friends of your mother's, my dear, and I would not have you break off old friendships for the world. Constancy above everything is my motto, as you know, and the memory of the dead ought always to be cherished." "Now, mamma, where am I to go?" asked Cynthia. "Though Lady Harriet does not care for me as much as she does for Molly, indeed quite the contrary, I should say, yet she might ask after me, and I had better be safely out of the way." "True," said Mrs. Gibson, meditatively, yet unconscious of any satire in Cynthia's speech. "She is much less likely to ask for you, my dear. I almost think you might stay in the house. Or you might go to the Holly Farm. I really do want the damsons. Or you might stay here in the dining room, you know, so as to be ready to arrange lunch prettily if she does take a fancy to stay for it. She is very fanciful, is dear Lady Harriet. I would not like her to think we made any difference in our meals because she stayed. Simple elegance, as I tell her, always is what we aim at. But still you could put out the best service, and arrange some flowers, and ask cook what there is for dinner that she could send us for lunch, and make it all look pretty and impromptu and natural. I think you had better stay at home, Cynthia, and then you could fetch Molly from the Miss Brownings in the afternoon, you know, and you two could take a walk together, after Lady Harriet was fairly gone. I understand, mamma. Off with you, Molly. Make haste, or Lady Harriet may come and ask for you as well as mamma. I'll take care and forget where you are going to, so that no one shall learn from me where you are, and I'll answer for mamma's loss of memory." "Child, what nonsense you talk! You quite confuse me with being so silly," said Mrs. Gibson, fluttered and annoyed, as she usually was with the Lilliputian darts Cynthia flung at her. She had recourse to her accustomed feckless piece of retaliation, bestowing some favour on Molly, and this did not hurt Cynthia one whit. "Molly, darling, there's a very cold wind, though it looks so fine. You had better put on my Indian shawl, and it would look so pretty too on your grey gown, scarlet and grey. It's not everybody I would lend it to, but you're so careful." "Thank you," said Molly, and she left Mrs. Gibson in careless uncertainty as to whether her offer would be accepted or not. Lady Harriet was sorry to miss Molly, as she was fond of the girl, but as she perfectly agreed with Mrs. Gibson's truisms about constancy and old friends, she saw no occasion for saying any more about the affair, but sat down in a little low chair with her feet on the fender. This said fender was made of bright steel, and was strictly tabooed to all household and plebeian feet. Indeed, the position, if they assumed it, was considered low-bred and vulgar. "That's right, dear Lady Harriet. You can't think what a pleasure it is to me to welcome you at my own fireside into my humble home." "Humble? Now, Clare, that's a little bit of nonsense, begging your pardon. I don't call this pretty little drawing-room a bit of a humble home. It is as full of comforts, and of pretty things too, as any room of its size can be." "Ah, how small you must feel it! Even I had to reconcile myself to it at first." "Well, perhaps your schoolroom was larger. But remember how bare it was, how empty of anything but deal tables and forms and mats. Oh, indeed, Clare, I quite agree with mamma, who always says you have done very well for yourself. And Mr. Gibson, too. What an agreeable, well-informed man." "Yes, he is," said his wife slowly, as if she did not like to relinquish her role of a victim to circumstances quite immediately. "He is very agreeable, very. Only we see so little of him. And of course he comes home tired and hungry, and not inclined to talk to his own family, and apt to go to sleep." "Come, come," said Lady Harriet, "I'm going to have my turn now. We've had the complaint of a doctor's wife, now hear the moans of a peer's daughter. Our house is so overrun with visitors, and literally to-day I've come to you for a little solitude." "Solitude!" exclaimed Mrs. Gibson. "Would you rather be alone?" Slightly aggrieved. "No, you dear silly woman. My solitude requires a listener, to whom I may say, 'How sweet is solitude!' But I am tired of the responsibility of entertaining. Papa is so open-hearted, he asks every friend he meets with to come and pay us a visit. Mamma is really a great invalid, but she does not choose to give up her reputation for good health, having always considered illness a want of self-control. So she gets wearied and worried by a crowd of people who are all of them open-mouthed for amusement of some kind, just like a brood of fledglings in a nest. So I have to be parent bird, and pop morsels into their yellow leathery bills, to find them swallowed down before I can think of where to find the next. Oh, it's entertaining, in the largest, literalist, dreariest sense of the word. So I've told a few lies this morning, and come up here for quietness and the comfort of complaining." Lady Harriet threw herself back in her chair, and yawned. Mrs. Gibson took one of her ladyship's hands in a soft sympathizing manner, and murmured, "Poor Lady Harriet," and then she purred affectionately. After a pause Lady Harriet started up, and said, "I used to take you as my arbiter of morals when I was a little girl. Tell me, do you think it wrong to tell lies?" "Oh, my dear, how can you ask such questions? Of course it is very wrong, very wicked indeed, I think I may say. But I know you were only joking when you said you had told lies." "No, indeed I was not. I told as plump fat lies as you would wish to hear. I said I was obliged to go into Hollingford on business, when the truth was there was no obligation in the matter, only an insupportable desire of being free from my visitors for an hour or two, and my only business was to come here and yawn and complain, and lounge at my leisure. I really think I'm unhappy at having told a story, as children express it. But, my dear Lady Harriet," said Mrs. Gibson, a little puzzled as the exact meaning of the words that were trembling on her tongue, "I am sure you thought that you meant what you said when you said it." "No, I didn't," put in Lady Harriet. "And besides, if you didn't, it was the fault of the tiresome people who drove you into such straits. Yes, it was certainly their fault, not yours. And then you know the conventions of society. Ah, what trammels they are!" Lady Harriet was silent for a minute or two. Then she said, "Tell me, Clare, you've told lies sometimes, haven't you?" "Lady Harriet, I think you might have known me better. But I know you don't mean it, dear." "Yes, I do. You must have told white lies at any rate. How did you feel after them?" "I should have been miserable if I ever had. I should have died of self-reproach. The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, has always seemed to me such a fine passage. But then I have so much that is unbending in my nature, and in our sphere of life there are so few temptations. If we are humble, we are also simple, and unshackled by etiquette." "Then you blame me very much? If somebody else will blame me, I shan't be so unhappy at what I said this morning." "I am sure I never blamed you, not in my inmost heart, dear Lady Harriet. Blame you, indeed! That would be presumption in me. I think I shall set up a confessor, and it shan't be you, Clare, for you have always been only too indulgent to me." After a pause she said, "Can you give me some lunch, Clare? I don't mean to go home till 3. My business will take me till then, as the people at the Towers are duly informed." "Certainly, I shall be delighted. But you know we are very simple in our habits." "Oh, I only want a little bread and butter, and perhaps a slice of cold meat. You must not give yourself any trouble, Clare. Perhaps you dine now. Let me sit down just like one of your family." "Yes, you shall. I won't make any alteration. It will be so pleasant to have you sharing our family meal, dear Lady Harriet. But we dine late. We only lunch now. How low the fire is getting! I really am forgetting everything in the pleasure of this tete-a-tete." So she rang twice, with great distinctness, and with a long pause between the rings. Maria brought in coals, but the signal was as well understood by Cynthia as the hall of Apollo was by the servants of Lucullus. The brace of partridges that were to have been for the late dinner were instantly put down to the fire, and the prettiest china put out, and the table decked with flowers and fruit, arranged with all Cynthia's usual dexterity and taste, so that when the meal was announced, and Lady Harriet entered the room, she could not but think her hostess's apologies had been quite unnecessary, and be more and more convinced that Clare had done very well for herself. Cynthia now joined the party, pretty and elegant as she always was, but somehow she did not take Lady Harriet's fancy. She only noticed her on account of her being her mother's daughter. Her presence made the conversation more general, and Lady Harriet gave out several pieces of news, none of them of any great importance to her, but as what had been talked about by the circle of visitors assembled at the Towers. "Lord Hollingford ought to have been with us," she said amongst other things, "but he is obliged, or fancies himself obliged, which is all the same thing, to stay in town about this Crichton legacy." "A legacy to Lord Hollingford! I am so glad." "Don't be in a hurry to be glad. It's nothing for him but trouble. Did not you hear of that rich eccentric Mr. Crichton, who died some time ago, and, fired by the example of Lord Bridgewater, I suppose, left a sum of money in the hands of trustees, of whom my brother is one, to send out a man with 1,000 fine qualifications to make a scientific voyage, with a view to bringing back specimens of the fauna of distant lands, and so forming the nucleus of a museum, which is to be called the Crichton Museum, and so perpetuate the founder's name? Such various forms does man's vanity take. Sometimes it stimulates philanthropy, sometimes a love of science." "It seems to me a very laudable and useful object, I am sure," said Mrs. Gibson safely. "I dare say it is, taking it from the public good view. But it is rather tiresome to us privately, for it keeps Hollingford in town, or between it and Cambridge, and each place as dull and empty as can be, just when we want him down at the Towers. The thing ought to have been decided long ago, and there's some danger of the legacy lapsing. The 2 other trustees have run away to the Continent, feeling, as they say, the utmost confidence in him, but in reality shirking their responsibilities. However, I believe he likes it, so I ought not to grumble. He thinks he is going to be very successful in the choice of his man, and he belongs to this county too, young Hamley of Hamley, if he can only get his college to let him go, for he's a fellow of Trinity, senior wrangler or something, and they're not so foolish as to send their crack man to be eaten up by lions and tigers." "It must be Roger Hamley!" exclaimed Cynthia, her eyes brightening and her cheeks flushing. "He's not the eldest son. He can scarcely be called Hamley of Hamley," said Mrs. Gibson. "Hollingford's man is a fellow of Trinity, as I said before." "Then it is Mr. Roger Hamley," said Cynthia, "and he's up in London about some business. What news for Molly when she comes home?" "Why, what has Molly to do with it?" asked Lady Harriet. And she looked into Mrs. Gibson's face for an answer. Mrs. Gibson, in reply, gave an intelligent and very expressive glance at Cynthia, who, however, did not perceive it. "Oh no, not at all," and Mrs. Gibson nodded a little at her daughter, as much as to say, if any one, that. Lady Harriet began to look at the pretty Miss Kirkpatrick with fresh interest. Her brother had spoken in such a manner of this young Mr. Hamley, that every one connected with the Phoenix was worthy of observation. Then, as if the mention of Molly's name had brought her afresh into her mind, Lady Harriet said, "And where is Molly all this time? I should like to see my little mentor. I hear she is very much grown since those days." "Oh, when once she gets gossiping with the Miss Brownings, she never knows when to come home," said Mrs. Gibson. "The Miss Brownings? Oh, I am so glad you named them. I am very fond of them. Pecksy and Flapsy, I may call them so in Molly's absence. I'll go and see them before I go home, and then perhaps I shall see my dear little Molly too. Do you know, Clare, I've quite taken a fancy to that girl." So Mrs. Gibson, after all her precautions, had to submit to Lady Harriet's leaving her half an hour earlier than she otherwise would have done, in order to "make herself common," as Mrs. Gibson expressed it, by calling on the Miss Brownings. But Molly had left before Lady Harriet arrived. Molly went the long walk to the Holly Farm to order the damsons out of a kind of penitence. She had felt conscious of anger at being sent out of the house by such a palpable manoeuvre, as that which her stepmother had employed. Of course she did not meet Cynthia, so she went alone, along the pretty lanes with grassy sides and high hedge banks, not at all in the style of modern agriculture. At first she made herself uncomfortable with questioning herself as to how far it was right to leave unnoticed the small domestic failings, the webs, the distortions of truth, which had prevailed in their household ever since her father's second marriage. She knew that very often she longed to protest, but she did not do it from the desire of sparing her father any discord, and she saw by his face that he too was occasionally aware of certain things that gave him pain, as showing that his wife's standards of conduct was not as high as he would have liked. It was a wonder to Molly if this silence was right or wrong. With a girl's want of toleration and want of experience to teach her the force of circumstances and of temptation, she had often been on the point of telling her stepmother some forcible home truths, but possibly her father's example of silence, and often some piece of kindness on Mrs. Gibson's part, for after her way, and when in a good temper, she was very kind to Molly, made her hold her tongue. That night at dinner, Mrs. Gibson recounted the conversation between herself and Lady Harriet, giving it a very strong individual colouring, as was her wont, and telling nearly the whole of what had passed, although implying that there was a great deal said that was so purely confidential that she was bound in honour not to repeat it. Her 3 auditors listened to her without interrupting her much, indeed without bestowing extreme attention on what she was saying, until she came to the fact of Lord Hollingford's absence in London, and the reason for it. "Roger Hamley going off on a scientific expedition!" exclaimed Mr. Gibson, suddenly awakened into vivacity. "Yes, at least it is not settled finally, but as Lord Hollingford is the only trustee who takes any interest, and being Lord Cumnor's son, it is next to certain." "I think I must have a voice in the matter," said Mr. Gibson, and he relapsed into silence, keeping his ears open, however, henceforward. "How long will he be away?" asked Cynthia. "We shall miss him sadly." Molly's lips formed an acquiescing yes to this remark, but no sound was heard. There was a buzzing in her ears, as if the others were going on with the conversation, but the words they uttered seemed indistinct and blurred. They were merely conjectures, and did not interfere with the one great piece of news. To the rest of the party she appeared to be eating her dinner as usual, and, if she were silent, there was one listener the more to Mrs. Gibson's stream of prattle, and Mr. Gibson's and Cynthia's remarks. End of chapter 32.